Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. What I was asked to talk about is a central question for sustainable development that is one of the few on which, when the academies of science around the world started addressing this issue, what could science do to help advance the cause of sustainable development, started to do that about 20 years ago. We had many answers, but no answer to this fundamental question. To me, the most impressive and important single advance in the state of the science over the last 20 years is we now have a theoretical framework that is well worked out, internally consistent and so on, and that is beginning to be paired with a dense empirical base that gives us the opportunity for both analyzing retrospectively the answer to that question and prospectively evaluating different alternatives of the sort we've heard about in energy, in health, and so on. So that's the advance I seek to outline. Let's begin by recalling that from the beginning of discussions about sustainable development, the idea of enhancing people's well-being, that is the central theme of this conference, has been right at its core. The photograph is of the famous Brundtland Report, the World Commission on Environment and Development, published in 1987, that argued the goal of sustainability should be meeting human needs of the present without sacrificing future generations' ability to meet their own needs. That has advanced in recent years from a slightly more expansive view of human needs to be human well-being. That is a prospective, positive view, not just escaping poverty and hunger, but a view that emphasizes the equity dimension from the beginning. That is, it is improving people's well-being now, but doing so in ways that do not do that present well-being in the here and now at the expense of people somewhere else because we dump our garbage in their backyards, or at the expense of our children and grandchildren in the future because we dump our garbage into their worlds, whether that is climate change or toxic materials and so forth. So an notion of inclusive well-being has been central to the goals of the sustainability agenda from the outset. Now, if you follow this debate, one might ask, well, what does that have to do with the new Sustainable Development Goals that the UN passed in 2015 and Professor Lutz already discussed? It's important to understand that despite their label as Sustainable Development Goals, the way the effort described itself is that these 17 things we should worry about were adopted as, quote, a blueprint to achieve a more sustainable future for all. Now, blueprints are not goals. They're means for achieving goals, which are whatever you were trying to build. So the SDGs have confused ends and means. They are a long list of really important things for us to do to achieve well-being, but they are not the end of well-being in itself. The end goal of sustainability remains inclusive well-being, while the means of achieving it are recognized to be caring for the multiple interacting components of our planet's environment development system, which in fact includes many of the things listed under the SDG framework. So with that background, the question, what do we actually need to focus on sustaining in order to be able to ensure this inclusive well-being for people now, in the future, and elsewhere on the planet? What is it we need to focus on not depleting? So our end goal, human well-being, inclusive across generations. Oops. The fact that we know whatever that human well-being is, we have to extract it from this thing we recognize to be an increasingly complex global scale system of interactions between the natural environment and human activities. And the question is, what are the core properties of that interactive system? For those who come up through systems modeling, what are the state variables that we need to pay attention to? For those who come up through the literatures of welfare economics, what are the stocks of capital assets that we need to sustain, to build up in order to assure that future generations and people elsewhere on the planet will have the same opportunities we have had to shape our own vision of well-being? The theory framework I'm going to outline here is due to a host of people, Pierce in the UK, Dasgupta, so forth and so on. We can go into that in questions. So the question is, what are those? The best analogy I have to know it, this is a photograph of Solar Impulse 2, the plane that recently completed a round-the-world flight purely based on solar power. And if you think the pilot in the cockpit had three indicators that were really essential to his, in this case it was his, notion of how he was doing. The first was obviously compass heading. Was he heading towards the goal he had elected for that day's flight? The second was airspeed. Was he getting there at a sufficient rate? But the third was the amp hours in his battery. How much charge was left in the battery? And that would, of course, go down during the night or cloudy periods. It would go back up when the solar was there. It didn't need to be held constant. But that battery charge was essentially what determined whether or not this journey towards specific goals with specific speed could be accomplished, as it were, in perpetuity. And what might happen is when the pilot found that reserve, the amount of charge still in the battery, going down too fast, he might have to somewhat alter his goals, go to a place where the headwinds were not as strong, might have to alter his airspeed, that is, slow the plane down in order to drive more efficiently, but those would be adjusted in order to sustain an adequate amount of charge in the battery. So what we have, just to give a way of writing this down, our notion of well-being is, in some useful thought experiment sense, like the battery charge, which I'm going to come to call inclusive wealth in a moment. But well-being is, am I going to achieve my goal? That is ultimately going to depend on whether you keep the battery charge from dropping too low. So the battery charge, the wealth of your reserves of amp hours, is a function of a set of things you've put into the battery and chance. They're essentially your state variables. What the advance in theory has told us is that inclusive wealth, that is, the charge in the battery, is not the same thing as achieving your goal, but under adequate piloting, it will track your goal. So if you monitor how well your battery's doing and then don't do stupid things about your direction and your airspeed, you will assure the sustainability of your work. So the question becomes, how can you, over suitable periods of time, and this the daily cycle, how can you keep that charge in the battery, your wealth you are passing on to tomorrow's pilot, from dropping too low? How can you keep it larger, the rate of change, over the daily or multiple daily cycle greater than or equal to 0? The question then becomes, well, okay, that's the analogy of amp hours in the battery. What are the amp hours on the planet Earth for us trying to actually achieve sustainability? Again, by analogy, because it's a short talk, I'm going to do the illustration of where the theory and empirics have gotten us with this one illustration of herring fishing off the coast of where I live in New England. So there is a set of stuff that is our amp hours that comes from nature, so-called natural capital. Start off with the biotic capital. If there were not fish in the sea, the fisherman's well-being is going to be very badly affected. And if the fish go away, other things being equal, the fisherman and his families and his grandchildren's well-being will decline. The physical chemistry capital, that is basically the climate and the character of the oceans. If the oceans are too acidic because of CO2 in the atmosphere, the fish are going to die, it isn't going to support them. If the climate is too choppy or stormy to sink the boat, that won't work either. So there's a physical chemical environment. Think in terms of our climate for the real world we're in. Third, mineral capital. I found it hard to extract that from this. Presumably the orlocks are made of iron, so you actually did need non-fuel minerals to do this. But more generally, whether it is fossil fuels or iron or cadmium or selenium or whatever, we need basic minerals. And as we deplete those, other things being equal, we remove opportunities for future generations to make use of the same things. Finally, there's geographic capital. often neglected in the so-called natural capital literature, but obviously a fisherman's future as a fisherman is not going to be well situated if he's growing up in the middle of a great plain, the middle of the hills of Italy. It demands, if that is your chosen lifestyle, that you adjust it and take advantage of the place you are, a coast area, a mountain area, and so forth. So we have a set of natural capital assets that need to be sustained in terms of their value to people. We also have a set of anthropic capital. Professor Lutz began the day talking about the centrality of human capital, the number, health, and crucially the education of people. Obviously, the fisherman, if he is too weak or too uneducated to be a good fisherman, is not going to have good well-being. Professor Lutz gave us the much broader argument for education and the like. Manufactured capital, the boat matters. More generally speaking, the transmission lines, the automobile, the electric automobiles, the solar power plants are a crucial part of this patrimony that we hand on to the next generation. And as we see in the streets of Rome, that decays at sometimes rapid rates. It is not simply a matter of building more of it, it is keeping that you have and want to sustain in good condition. Third, there is knowledge capital. Again, this in the present case is the knowledge passed down to the fisher of how to fish, of how to build boats. Even if this fisher were wiped off the face of the earth, there would be people and books and patents back in his community to teach us how to fish and how to build boats unless that was lost. Often underappreciated is how rapidly the knowledge foundations on which we base the prospects for handing on well-being to the future decay. There was a point not many years ago in which the knowledge of how to build and sail wind-powered fighting ships was the crucial issue in which countries would triumph in world contests. Today, that information's value has gone to zero. We could say the same for many of the crops that were the initial contributions of the Green Revolution. We might even say the same for high-efficiency combustion technologies for fossil fuels. The point is that without renewing knowledge capital with serious investments in R&D, we are giving, not building the heritage we're handing on to our children, that is decaying out from under them. And that has certainly been true given the radically declining investment in public good creation around the world. Finally, there's social capital. You see other boats on the horizon. The reason they are not trying to sink this guy is because presumptively of social arrangements about who gets to fish in the fishery, how we share the limited number of fish there, how we regulate entry. More broadly, our social capital is our ability to build treaties, international agreements, certification schemes, and the like. And as was remarked by a couple of people earlier today, if there's one of these capital assets that seems to be in the most rapid decline around the world today, many of my fellow ecologists would say it's biotic capital, biodiversity. I, in fact, would argue it's social capital. Our ability and willingness to reach agreements with one another over common goals and execute those over the long period. And without those, this guy's success in all the other dimensions of fishing will go away because it will be a fight to the death and the bottom of the different fishers trying to mine a finite resource. So expanding the annotation, wealth, the thing we're trying to hand on from one generation to another, non-depleted, is a function of not just any old capital assets, but quite literally this set of state variables. That doesn't say when we're trying to model this, we need to treat everyone dynamically at the same time. Any sensible modeler knows that. But it does mean we have to remember that in the real system, those are the state variables of the system. Those are the interacting foundations of dynamics. And if we decide to hold technology, knowledge constant, or institutions constant, as say the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change does with its climate scenarios, we better remember we did that and then go back and check the conditions, what that conditionalizing did for our predictions or our scenarios. So this is not just a story. The empirics are following along. The Dutch recently did an elegant story of 100 years of the Netherlands' development and 100 years of its future done in exactly this framework of capital assets. The World Bank has begun to report out systematically on the history of whose asset base, whose wealth is rising and falling. Weirdly, the rising ones are the white ones, the falling ones are the dark ones. You can wonder why China seems to be the most sustainable country on the planet. That is partly because they are, and partly because many assets are still left out because of inadequate empirics in this work. Where that ends us up was we have a vision of the capital assets that need to be maintained. I want to close by stressing those are necessary but not sufficient conditions. This system of the planet's Earth life support systems is not just a machine running along like a well-wired clock. It is something that different actors, different people with or without power are pulling on to generate well-being for them rather than for you. And so what we know is natural inequalities amplified by positive returns to scale mean that the system is being run by a very few for a very few. It's not for the poor, it's not for the marginalized, and it's not for future generations. So with all this notion, we now have a theory for what needs to be sustained. The bottom line I want to leave you with is that sustainability also requires an active political struggle on behalf of the poor and unborn, because they're the ones that will be left out by operating under business as usual, acquisitive notion of well-being for a few in the now and present. Thank you very much.